men in Napoleon's army had done something. The historical record is not exactly clear what the offense was, but it was very serious. And so this man had been sentenced to death. And on the day of his execution, his mother sought out Napoleon to plead for mercy. And you can imagine how any mother would want to do that. So she finally finds Napoleon, states her case. She says to him, "Please, would you let my son live?" And he said to her, "I cannot do that. He has committed this offense twice. I need to punish him because of justice." But she would not relent. And she continued these pleas for his life because she is so concerned. And finally, she says, "I am not asking you for justice. I am asking you for mercy." And Napoleon said, "He doesn't deserve mercy." And the mother said, "That is exactly right. But I'm not asking for justice. I am pleading for mercy. And if he deserved mercy, it wouldn't be mercy." And Napoleon thought about that for a few minutes, and he let the man live. Do you see exactly what was happening with that? There is a huge difference between justice and mercy. And I think I can sum it up really, really well. When other people mess up, we want them to have justice. And when we mess up, we want to have mercy. We have no reason to stand before God and expect that he's going to forgive us or even love us, but he does that because he is a merciful God. He is a loving God who cares about us intimately. That's the thing that makes all the difference. And I'm wondering why it is that we have so much trouble in our lives practicing that same kind of love and mercy to other people. Now, I'm going to come back to that question. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you why you think it is that we have so much trouble extending mercy to others. So I want you to be thinking about that because it's a very important question and a very vital issue in our daily lives and relationships. We need to know what gets in the way so we can get those barriers out of the way and do what Jesus wants us to do. Now, you probably sit here today and think you know exactly what mercy is. Maybe you do, and maybe you don't. At least from a biblical point of view, there's a different kind of perspective. You may not realize this, but the Bible actually has two emphases when it comes to mercy. Two ways to help us understand exactly what's going on. And the first one is actually found in Matthew chapter 6. And if you were to go there, you would see this teaching about giving to the needy. Now, if you're wondering what that has to do with mercy, just hold the thought. This is what Jesus says. Watch out. So notice he's giving a caution here right off the bat. He says, watch out. Don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets, taking to the streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth. They've received all the reward they're going to get. But when you give to the needy, give your gifts in private, and your Father, who sees everything, will reward you. Now, you're probably familiar with that principle. If we're going to do good to people, then it's not something we need to telegraph. It's not something we need to broadcast so everyone will give us the credit, because if credit is all we're after, then we already have our reward. That's exactly what he says here. But this idea of taking care of the vulnerable, the root word for that in New Testament Greek is related to the root word for mercy or merciful. In other words, when we take care of other people, that is an act of mercy. And that's how the scriptures frame it for us. We sometimes think, look at us. Aren't we wonderful? Look at all the good things we're going to do for these people that are in so much need. And yet, that's not the attitude we see in Jesus at all. He wants us to do what's good and what's right because all of us are created in the image of God. All of us have experienced the love of God and the forgiveness of God in our own lives, and so we are obligated to share that with other people. That should be the motivation behind everything we do. And so one of the things we have to realize is that when it comes to this idea of mercy, taking good care of the people in our circle is very much part and parcel of that whole thing. That's what it all comes down to. And Jesus even explains the reason for that later on in chapter 6. If you remember, this is the chapter where he talks about the Lord's Prayer. He gives this model prayer for his disciples to follow. And you know that prayer. You probably remember the old King James version if you're of an age. Listen to this. I think a lot of people don't realize what Jesus is saying in this because we're so accustomed to reading these words. They just kind of glide off the tongue. We don't really let them anchor in our hearts. But he says, may your kingdom come soon. In other words, let's take heaven and make it a reality here on earth. And then he goes on to say, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today the food we need. Easy to understand. But then he says, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. What does he mean by that? What does that mean? Forgive us, God, as we forgive those who sin against us. Yeah, we will be treated with the same measure. In other words, we're asking God to forgive us to the extent and in the way that we forgive others. Can you pray that prayer? I want you to stop and think for a minute about the people in your life who most need your forgiveness, because we've all got them. Every one of us. There are people who have hurt us. There are people who have exploited us. There are people who have traumatized us in many cases. And Jesus says, I get that. But that does not give you an exemption from forgiving them. Now, I need to make it clear that when Jesus talks about love and forgiveness, he's not talking about warm, fuzzy feelings here. The word is agape. It means putting the best interests of other people first. It means not giving them what they deserve, not wanting anything bad to happen to them. And that's hard enough in its own. That's hard enough in its own. But we are commanded to be people of love and people who are going to look at things differently. And Jesus says, God will forgive us the way we forgive other people. That's the ideal. So if we're not going to forgive other people, that is going to impair God's ability to forgive us if he holds true to that. Now look, I'm not going to presume that if you don't forgive somebody, God's not going to forgive you. I know there's some people who take a hard line on that, and they think that that's exactly what this says. Maybe it does, and maybe this is just Jesus saying, this is the ideal. I don't know what God's going to do, and frankly, neither do you. But what we do know is that this is the standard to which we are called. We need to give our forgiveness and our love the same way we want to receive it from other people and from God himself. All right. Peter goes to Jesus and says, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Peter probably thought he was being really generous here. I mean, after all, if somebody victimizes you 7 times and you're willing to let that go 7 times, that seems pretty generous to me. Notice what Jesus says here. He says, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now, does he mean that literally? No, but he means you just don't get to give up. He says, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. And in the process, one of his debtors was brought to him, and this man owed millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt, because that's what happened in the first century. If you had any assets, but you had a debt and you could not pay, then they seized everything that you had and you went to jail, and your family also suffered. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, please be patient with me. I'll pay it all. And then his master was filled with pity for him. And he released him and forgave his debt. He's not just giving him more time here. It says he forgave his debt. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. And he grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. I'm not even sure why he would do that, but this is what happens. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me and I will pay it, he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait, and he had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. And so they went to the king and they told him everything that had happened. And then the king called in the man who had been forgiven and said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have shown mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? And that's the whole point, ladies and gentlemen. We have been forgiven this debt, an amazing debt, a debt that otherwise would have separated us from God for eternity. The whole idea of the cross is to demonstrate God's love for us. Jesus makes this sacrifice because there is nothing we can do to save ourselves. And so the whole idea here is that if we are going to accept that blessing, if that's going to inform the way we live our lives, then we need to extend that to everybody else, including the difficult, the people that don't deserve it, the people that will never appreciate it. In short, everybody. Everybody. Jesus looks at the religious leaders of his day in Matthew 9, and he says, you're pretty good about all the churchy stuff. You give me all your sacrifices. You go through the rituals. He says, I don't want sacrifices. I want mercy. He's not talking about mercy for him. He's talking about the mercy they needed to extend to the people under their pastoral care. Because mercy was a priority for Jesus Christ. Mercy was so important because it's the essence of everything that he is and all that he does. And it needs to be the same with us. In Titus chapter 3, verse 5, we read that we have been forgiven. We have salvation from God, not because of the righteous things we have done, Paul writes, but because of the great and infinite mercy of God. So that's where this all comes down. We need to give it because we've got it. We don't earn God's favor by the mercy that we extend to people, but we should do it because it's just such an outpouring of what we feel for what God has done for us. Can you do that? Can that become part of who you are if it's not right now? And your answer to that is probably, well, with some people. Because like I said, we all have people in our lives that we need to forgive. Maybe you need to forgive yourself. Because I would submit to you that if you can't forgive yourself for your past or what you're up to, then you probably can't move on and forgive other people. Because we tend to exact the same kind of judgment upon others that we have for ourselves, unless we're on the other extent, on the other extreme. And that's when we are so much more harsh with other people, even though we can turn a blind eye to our own misgivings and our shortcomings. If you acknowledge that you need God, then you need to take that the next step and say, if I can accept his forgiveness, his acceptance, his love, then I need to carry that forward and make that a reality in my own life. So let me go back to my original question. Why is it that we find it so hard to be merciful to other people? Tell me. I think there are 4 or 5 good reasons here. Yeah. Exactly. If you didn't hear what she said, Nancy said, it's scary because they might hurt us again. And you know people like that. I would love to tell you that if you just do the right thing all the time, everyone's going to respond wonderfully to that and we'll all live happily ever after. And you know that's not the truth. Yes, there are people who will take advantage of us. But you need to forgive them anyway. It doesn't mean you need to lead with your chin. And I think it's really important for us to understand that mercy is not exacting a penalty, but it doesn't mean that you have to be stupid about it. Forgiveness never means that we forget what people did to us. And forgiveness doesn't mean that what they did was okay. Same with mercy. It just means that we acknowledge those things and we're committed to not making them pay the way we'd like to make them pay. We recognize that God will take care of that situation. So we need to be discerning, but we can't be afraid of what people are going to do and make that a condition of forgiveness or mercy or compassion. What else? Why else do we have so much trouble? If we're not going to forgive, we're going to have to confront the reality that we're not perhaps who we thought we were. If we can't seem to let go of certain things, then that is going to undermine our confidence in us. And so I think it's really important that we see that God can get us to where we need to be. This idea of mercy and forgiveness is sometimes a process. I don't expect that if you've been traumatized by somebody that you're just going to automatically be able to turn around and say, okay, we're good. It doesn't work that way in real life. And even Jesus acknowledges that. Forgiveness is something like every other virtue that has to be worked on, but it cannot be conditional on the other person's behavior or their attitude or how much they appreciate it. It has to be something that comes from us. We give mercy because we've gotten mercy. We give mercy because it's in our best interest to give mercy. Because what happens if you do not extend mercy and forgiveness? What happens to you? You're going to get resentful, you're going to get bitter, you're going to be undermined in every way because it will be a sack of garbage you carry through your life, and the only person that's going to suffer is you. I hope you realize that if there are people that you need to show mercy to and you're not willing to do that, half the time they don't care. You're the one carrying the burden. They don't even know. I think that's often true. They don't even know. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know how much you're preoccupied by this. All they know is, all right, there's an estrangement in the relationship. Maybe that's going to be enough just to end it there. You know, I interviewed a guy in Uganda one time. His name is John Achola. A young boy in his village told some soldiers from the rebels trying to take over the country that John was a former military man. And of course, the rebels were in direct opposition to the Ugandan army, so they kidnapped John. And they took him into the bush, and they cut off his ears, and they took his nose with a machete. And then they chopped off his right hand so he could never hold a gun again. John had never been in the Ugandan army. He was not a soldier, and one little boy's lie cost him almost his life and certainly cost him his livelihood. All because of one lie. I talked to John. John told me he had actually tried to find that young man because he wanted him to know that he forgave him. He said, I carried a lot around for years. It was really hard for me. And he said to me, and I'll never forget the way he said this, he said, I have finally put the burden down. I've finally put the burden down. We need to realize that that lack of love, that lack of forgiveness, that lack of mercy is always going to be inflicted upon us, sometimes even more than other people. So it is in our self-interest to give what is ours to give in every way, including mercy. Why else do we find it so hard, though? Yes, it's fear. Yes, it means we have to confront that perhaps we're not who we think we are if we're unwilling or unable to forgive. What else? If we're going to make deserving the criterion, then we're all going to be in big trouble because none of us is deserving of what God does for us. A big part of the problem is that we are more interested in labels than love. Would you agree with me on that? I think sometimes that really gets in the way. We look at people and we label them, and then that defines how we treat them. Once an addict? Sure. Once a thief? Always a thief. We have a tendency to adapt that mentality where when people make it clear that they have messed up, we're quite content to hold them where they are or to assume that they cannot change. And let me tell you, if you're sitting in this room today and your core ideal is that people can never change, well, then you better start looking at yourself. Because that tells me either you haven't changed and you have no intention of changing, or you're just being very exclusive about when change can happen. You cannot look into somebody's heart. You cannot look into somebody's life and know exactly what they're going to do. You just can't do that because you don't know. We have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And it means that sometimes we're going to have to go first, and we're going to have to do the hard thing, and we're going to have to suck it up until the other person responds. And I'll tell you now, sometimes they won't. Their response, whatever somebody does with the forgiveness and the mercy that you offer, is none of your business. That's between them and God. They're going to have to work that out. And it may take you a while to get to where you need to be so that you're in a position to extend that willingness to forgive, but you can do that with the power of God. Can you do it on your own? Doubtful. You won't even try to do it on your own, but if you understand that God is part of the package, that He's the impetus, that He's the power, then you stand a much better chance of making it work. It's just the way it is. And you know, the truth of the matter is, if we're completely honest with ourselves, it all comes down in some cases to revenge. If we think that withholding forgiveness is having an effect, yes, there are people that it won't affect, but if we know that it is having an effect, sometimes that's enough to make us kind of twist the knife a little bit. You know, we take a perverse delight in knowing that, okay, they're suffering after what they did to me. That's the complete opposite of what Jesus wants us to do. But sometimes we have been hurt so much that we can't let go of the hurt. We don't even want to let go of the hurt. It becomes a constant companion. It's almost comfortable. It becomes part of who we are. And then to relinquish that means it's like giving up a part of ourselves and the things that bring us security and comfort. I understand that. But we just can't live that way because, again, it comes back to haunt us. I think another thing that I notice often is some people consider mercy to be weakness. If I forgive, they will think I'm weak, or other people will think I'm weak. Maybe it'll turn me into some kind of doormat. And that doesn't need to be the case either. We have to acknowledge that forgiveness and mercy are powerful. They do change hearts and lives. Not all the time, not in every case, but I've seen so many ways in which this is the reality. The minute we give up on any hope that God can change somebody through love and acceptance, we're in big trouble. It was Jesus who said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are we when we give mercy, because we will get mercy." It's not just that idea that God's going to give what we give. It has to do with the fact that if you are considerate, gentle, humble, and merciful to the people in your life, then you can reasonably expect that most people are going to return that to you. You see, mercy is reciprocal only in the sense that God gives it to us and we want to give it back to Him, but it's not a transaction. It's not a transactional thing. When you give mercy to other people, you can't expect they're going to give you anything in return. It has to be a gift that you give freely, a gift that you give completely, and a gift that you give unconditionally. And if you're willing to do that, then good things can happen in relationships. I have seen this over and over and again. People sit in my office. There have been breakthroughs when people are willing to take the initiative, to go first, to be vulnerable, to talk things out. And if you can't do that, to at least get to the stage where you're not going to carry the burden around anymore either. You have two choices. You can walk through life with 2 bags of garbage in your hands and it's going to get caught up in everything that you see and touch. Or you can put the burden down and you can be who God calls you to be. And I'm not saying it's quick, and I am not saying in the least that it's easy. But what I am saying, it's necessary. It's necessary for your relationship to God. It's necessary for your internal sense of who you are. And it's necessary for your relationship with other people. Your life will be blessed. Your life will be better if and when you extend mercy. Not just when it's quick, not when it's convenient, but when you extend mercy all the time to everyone. That's your homework.